All right, welcome everybody. I'm Mary Ellen Slayter, and I'm the CEO and founder of RepCap. We're a content marketing agency that specializes in HR tech, insurance, and financial services. Sorry, I'm in Phoenix this week for a conference. My brain is mush. I'm really excited about this particular webinar because it's going to get a little meta. This is a webinar about webinars, and I'm very excited about this because I've invited Hannah over here for my favorite platform for webinars, BigMarker, to come over and join us and talk about like what actually makes an awesome webinar. So I didn't think about it from the content perspective. So I think those of you who've come to these webinars before, I often tell people like we were not an events marketing company before the pandemic. If you asked me if I would do events like real live events, absolutely not. That's about catering contracts and insurance. However, virtual events are all about content. So I got very excited about content. Hannah, how did you wind up hanging out and making in this webinar world? When did that start to? Oh, someone says no audio. There's no audio on their end.
I can hear you, Mary Ellen. Can the folks in the chat hear me? It looks like only maybe a couple people can't hear though. So, okay. It looks like for the most part, most people have audio. So let's just go ahead and move on. So no, to answer your question, Mary Ellen, we certainly have had an interesting kind of, or I certainly have had an interesting kind of dive into BigMarker. So, from what's on the slide, you can see that I've been with BigMarker for 8 years, which is crazy. It feels like it's gone by in the blink of an eye. But I actually, funny enough, started in fashion before moving on over to webinars and tech. But what really drew me to BigMarker was their story. And so long ago in 2010 actually, or 2011, 2010, somewhere around there, BigMarker was founded on the principle that if you have the right tools, you can make a really big mark on the world. And that story kind of drew me in, and I really kind of took this path into what at the time for me was really uncharted territory. It was tech, it was webinars, it was at the time we were calling it web conferencing. But fast forward all these years later, really wearing a lot of hats in the space. So, obviously sitting in a marketing and partnerships role today, but also being in enterprise sales and, also in customer success, account management, knowing all of these kind of sides of the business. And of course, knowing the tech really, really well, it's just kind of helped shape this really well-rounded perspective of webinars, and is why I'm talking with you today. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. Happy to dive in, but yeah, that's a little bit more about me.
I have all these questions about that fashion retailing thing. We'll come back to that some other time.
That was the dream, and it did not turn out the way that everyone thinks. It's not as glamorous as it seems. So
I tell people that too. We actually work with some e-com like backbone, like tech companies as some clients. And I always tell people, it's like, you think that the people who work here are cool, but they actually have clipboards. Right? They actually walk around a warehouse, and they have your buyer is not a cool fashionista. Your buyer is actually a person in a checkered shirt with a clipboard who's really annoyed that those boxes are right there. That's kind of takes all the fun out of it. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about webinars from a few different angles. One of them is like we're going to talk about how to develop content that actually connects with your buyer and their specific pain points. We're going to talk about how to promote registration. Like, so if you have a webinar, will people come? We're going to talk about how to make the experience a little better. And actually, some of the things features I like in BigMarker, which Hannah's going to even do like in the middle of this. You guys can see and how easy it is in the tool, but it's not a PowerPoint dump. Nobody actually wants to see that. You want to see human beings. And then I'm going to talk here at the end a little bit about how I use AI in order to take this content when you make it to create other types of content, because I find that I do a lot of B2B marketing. Webinars are a staple of the plans, and like in the end that thing happens and then it goes away. It doesn't have to be that way. You can actually, I call it messy content, and I take that messy content and I turn it into stuff, and I use AI for that. But the first thing I want to say actually is I want to sort of defend the webinar for a moment. I think a lot of people think that webinars are dead in the same way they talk about email being dead. None of those things are true for either thing. The reality is that you're probably doing it in an outdated way, because some of the best performing campaigns that I see right now actually have not a guide or a report as their cornerstone asset, but a webinar is the cornerstone asset, or a virtual event. we'll get into the difference between those two a little bit later, but I just want to get that out of the way. Like, webinars are absolutely not dead. They are the best, I consider them the best gated content experience around right now, because you still got to sign up. So, all right, let's talk about from a thought leadership perspective. So I'm going to ask you, how do we use webinars in terms of the content? Like, Hannah, what are you seeing right now as like the most effective type of content that's presented in webinars?
So I actually, before I answer this question, I want to poll the audience because I want to hear what the people say. So, the first question that I have that I want to share is, are you guys currently using webinars as a part of your marketing strategy in 2023? So you should see the poll pop up on screen. Now you have the ability to answer it, but as you can see here, it's open, ready for you to share, and feel free to answer it. I think that, this is something that I'm very interested to know, how people are using it. Everyone who's answered so far has said yes. So everyone here, there's actually a couple people coming in that are saying no, but for the most part, it looks like most of the people who are here today are hosting webinars, probably want to know how they can use them better or more effectively to achieve their goals. And so my next question, of course, is, what are your goals? What is your kind of primary goal or your KPIs that you're really using to indicate your webinar success? And so I'm actually going to send another poll right back to back. And I've just sent that as well. So, if you folks want to take some time to answer this as well, because I think we're going to start to see some trends. You'll see lead generation, brand awareness, thought leadership, audience engagement, or maybe something else that's not listed here. Drop your answers or your responses. But, while you guys are answering that, going back to, using webinars effectively, a lot of B2B marketing webinars that we're seeing, obviously, there's lots of webinars out there, but when we focus on B2B, which is, what a lot of webinars are being used for today, or marketing webinars in general, is for lead generation. And my hunch was correct. As we see the answers coming in, lead generation is definitely taking that kind of running spot as being the primary use case for webinars. And Mary Ellen, you had mentioned the same thing, which is that, what we're all using this today for is obviously we want to optimize, a platform for generating leads, and we need that registration form to do so. But when we think about what makes, a good webinar or even a great webinar, thought leadership is going to be at the kind of primary focus, when we think about this or talk about this, because we want people to know that what we're talking about actually matters, and we care about it, and we want to make sure that they care about it. And we're kind of creating this synergistic or this synergy, environment between the two of us. And we kind of want to break up the content feed. Written content or ebooks or guides are great, but it's going to be that two-dimensional feed in your content feed. When you have webinars, you have engagement. I just triggered 2 polls. We get to hear from our audience in real time. We also saw the chat was kind of going crazy with letting us know where people were from. We saw people all over the world are attending today's session. And I'm assuming we're going to get into an awesome Q&A at the end where we get to actually hear from our audience. So yes, thought leadership is at the paramount of everything we care about. We want to know what our industry is talking about. We want to stand out from our industry and have our own perspectives, share that thought leadership, but we also want to connect with our audience in a meaningful way. So I want to hear what your thoughts are. I could obviously talk on this topic a lot more, but Mary Ellen, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, I draw distinctions between different types of webinars. So there's a type of, one of the problems that I come in sometimes when I come in, I'm working with people and they say, well, we do webinars and they don't work. And then I take a look and I find out what they're actually doing are product demos. And while product demos can be a very important part of that overall buyer journey, that is such an end of the line, like show me how to use my product. That's really for people who are very close to buying or that are already your customers. So do those, but understand those will not give you leads. Those will not give you brand awareness. Those will not give you any kind of your engagement. It's just a different type of engagement. So I like to back out. I think of webinars as a full funnel activity or a full journey activity. So this particular type of webinar, for example, we do these monthly, and they are intended primarily for brand awareness, right? New people have never heard of us. This is our primary list growth activity. I don't gate written content. This is gated because you have to gate it for the experience. So that seems like a fair exchange of value. And I don't pitch. pitching this. There's no pitching. There's only sharing knowledge and sharing expertise. And I like to do it with a partner because then that helps everybody learn more. I really like to see people do that kind of approach. Like that helps keep you honest in making it true thought leadership. The other type, then you kind of go through, there's also things you can do. My clients also come to this, which I think is a good thing. I look at that and I go, oh, they care what I have to say. So I look at it that way. That's also a customer touch point. So it's primarily for me about, teaching people how to do things and sharing information and having that engagement. So I actually checked audience engagement. Like, do I get leads from this? Absolutely. Is it my primary purpose at this type of webinar? No way. No way.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And also you kind of bring up a good point. It really does depend on your goals. And what we always recommend when you are creating your content or thinking about, what do we want to talk about next? We always recommend to think backwards. And the reason being is that, again, webinars, you're not, or you shouldn't, if you're hosting a good one, we're not just talking at people and closing the door. The whole point of having a live experience is that you can interact with your audience, you can engage with them, and you can also parse out more information from them than any other traditional sort of marketing tool, that is going to be, again, that two-dimensional, kind
it's
of
true. I can see how long you stay. I can see like what you answered. I can see if you showed up in the chat. Like, I love these. I get a lot of really positive energy because our webinars, a lot of people register and most of them attend, at least half of them tend to attend. Like, and I'm told those are very high numbers. But I'm here for that. That's what I get on here for, is to chat with you. So I actually don't like pre-recorded webinars very much because I don't get the same boost from it personally. Let's talk about promotion a little bit. This is something that comes up a lot too when I look at why people's webinars are not succeeding. And it's often because they're not giving themselves adequate time to promote it. And promotion can include, depending on your goals, right? So like we talked about this, Hannah, in the prep for this call, like, for if your primary goal with your webinar is to engage with your existing audience, you're going to be looking at email, right? And you can have a certain cadence that's going to work with that. We use LinkedIn. We use a LinkedIn event. We have ads that run. And if you're going to use ads to promote to a new audience, you need to give yourself at least 30 days. But I don't know, I think, Hannah, why don't you talk about that a little bit? Because I personally like to see at least a month. I want to see 4 weeks minimum, 6 to 8 ideally. What's your ideal timeline?
So again, I have one last poll just because we have them already ready to go. And I want to ask the audience, how far in advance do you typically promote your own webinars? So I have that again, kind of flashing up on the audience screen for you guys. But give me your thoughts, because actually, again, as Mary Ellen said, it really kind of depends on who we're serving and how this kind of factors into our marketing mix. Because when you promote a webinar, what we typically see, at least, as a webinar provider, is that most or majority of your registrations are coming from a mailing list, like you just said, Mary Ellen. So that's, point A. And point B is that we typically see them registering about a little over a week in advance. And so the question begs is, how are we going to promote this successfully or effectively if we're doing it well in advance? Well, there's a couple of things to note. So again, when we're looking at advertising, or when we're looking at, kind of adding in other factors where we're kind of building, this lead generation tool, which it sounds like, you're doing really effectively with all of your different kind of methods of promotion, where will that promotion happen most effectively? It's probably going to be, further in advance, because you cast, a bigger net, you're going to catch more fish. However, when we look at, again, that registration timeline, when we look at, people registering from our list and so on and so forth, it's going to be a shorter timeline. So I think using that strategically in your promotional strategy is probably the key here. So again, when we're doing outreach, when we're doing kind of targeted approach to, again, ads or whatever we're doing, maybe making that 4 to 6 or even more, weeks in advance, but then maybe sending out our emails a couple weeks in advance, and then sending some reminders, for the people who didn't open, for example. So it's really dependent on your strategy. But, those are the numbers that we're seeing. And, Mary Ellen, I'm very interested in what your thoughts are on this as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, somebody mentioned in the chat that they said it depends on how frequently you hold them. And if they're monthly, it makes more sense to promote them 2 to 3 weeks in advance. I actually, not necessarily. I do monthly webinars, but I can have a promotion cadence. I don't decide them on the monthly basis. So I can, if a webinar is in March, I can start promoting it in mid-January, regardless of having a February webinar. Like they're kind of overlapping. Like there's nothing wrong with that, with having like multiple campaigns going. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, obviously you have to know your list and you have to know how you're reaching out, but like we always have multiple overlapping campaigns promoting different webinars because they're on slightly different topics. And that also helps me, it kind of de-risks it, frankly, because if one of them is a dud, the next one can take off. I also thought it was interesting. Somebody said that they might have 100 people who say they'll attend an event, but less than 20% actually do. 20% is actually what I consider the benchmark for a B2B webinar. So if 20% are showing up, that's actually good. Mm-hmm. And then I find that I usually, our numbers are generally higher, and I'll just be grateful for that. There's probably lots of reasons that lead to that. It's like marketers like to go to marketing webinars. So then people watch it. I find that the on-demand thing, people often think people are going to watch things on demand, but that is more, I find that I send the email that's right after that says it's now available on demand, and I'll get a little spike of a few percentage points. But then after that, it's done. I don't find that people actually come watch it on demand. And I don't know why. I know other people have better experience with that, but that's not my experience. I do appreciate how easy BigMarker makes it. Like the landing page is like, so we'll finish this, mm-hmm. and then the webinar, it renders for me, and then it publishes. Like it's on demand and it's already in the same place. You don't have to go anywhere weird. I don't have to download it and put it in a separate landing page or any of that stuff. So,
right.
But yeah, I like a little time, but that's how I decide. I decided, like, am I trying to get new people? I need more time. If I'm just hitting my list, 2 or 3 weeks is fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good wisdom.
Yeah, this is about audience engagement. Some of the ways that you can make it more interesting. One of the things you'll notice in this particular presentation is that Hannah and I are not dumping a bunch of slides on you. Those slides are mostly there for wayfaring and to remind us what we're supposed to be talking about, and I got to keep it to anchor and organize our talks. Mm-hmm. Hannah, what are some of the things that you do? I know we've got polls already in here. What are some other ways to make the content more engaging?
Yeah, definitely. And this is my favorite part of webinars. I think I've kind of harped on this throughout, the entire presentation so far, but if I haven't harped on it enough, I'm going to do it some more. So again, the biggest benefit that you can, or the biggest service that you can do to yourself when you host webinars is you engage your audience. Not only is it going to increase audience satisfaction, but it's going to keep them engaged longer, which is just a fact. When you look at the numbers, when you look at the analytics of your reports, you see that highly engaged audiences are more likely to stay. They're likely to stay there longer. They're likely to come back and attend more webinars, and they're more likely to attribute positive feelings, about your brand and about your content when they attend. And so how do we kind of instill this engaging environment? How can we use tools to our advantage? Well, of course, we've already seen polls. So polls are super effective for a lot of reasons. It's because obviously it's the easiest way to engage. You just click a button as an attendee. You don't need to ask a compelling question, which obviously we certainly encourage, but in those Q&As. But it's the click of a button. It's the easiest way to engage, and it delivers a wealth of information in return. And so polling is number one. And actually one of the things or pieces of content that I wanted to share today is, our corresponding benchmark report. You'll actually find it in the handout section if you guys want to download it. I know we'll refer to this, in the slides at some point later today. But, getting the juices flowing about, how to use polls effectively is super, super important, because not only is it going to, be able to engage with your audience, but it's also allowing you to do something called progressive profiling, or building a profile around your, personas or your attendees in the webinar. So what you can do is you can ask what I would call like more intimate questions than something that you would ask on a registration form when people are registering for your webinars. So obviously when people register for your webinars, we know, a little bit about them, right? We know their name, we know their email, we might know something like their job title, but we don't know, how they're using our product or what they're interested in learning about. Polls are a great kind of vehicle for that. And so that's number one. Q&As and being able to, kind of connect with your audience on a deeper level by answering their questions and actually engaging with them in real time is a huge other benefit to webinars when we think about, how we engage our audience. So I always recommend hosting a Q&A at least in the end, but also if you're hosting a really long session, or if you're thinking about doing like a more virtual event where you have all these kind of compiled sessions kind of happening concurrently, or, as a part of the event, Q&A is a great way to connect with those audiences, break up the feed. So it's not just that kind of talking at you, it's more talking with you. And then also just referring into the chat, making sure that you're keeping an eye on it, seeing where people are coming from, or if they have a point that you want to kind of connect with in that moment. All of that is, fair game.
I think that for me, that's what it feels like, a conversation. It's interesting you were talking about the regressive profiling. I mean, I think sometimes as marketers, we think about gathering this information in a way that this feels like a conversation. I'm going to walk away knowing way more about y'all than you would have ever told me in a form, but it was a conversation. And also because I gave you something in exchange for that attention and that information. So thank you for that. I 100% agree with that. Let's see, we already had polls and chat and Q&A. This is what I told y'all, we don't really care about our slides. This was an interesting chart. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yes. So I do want to talk about this a little bit. So this is actually graphs from our benchmark report that I just referred to. Again, it's in the handout section if you guys want to download it and get more information about it. But basically, one element of this benchmark report is kind of narrowing down or paring down on, how to effectively utilize polls to get the best results. And what you may have noticed is that I kind of front loaded a lot of these polls, and I actually did that strategically because what we see is that attendees who engage in polls early on, in the first 10 minutes, for example, or first 20 minutes, which is typically their peak, are going to be more engaged throughout the entire presentation. And what we've also found, which I believe is our next slide, but let me just check really quick.
I could go over that. That's also interesting.
So I'm going to go right to it. Is the poll response by poll number. So the number of times you poll your audience actually matters. So we saw that we did 3 polls. Again, that is not on accident. So how we think about this is that it kind of has this concept of FOMO, or fear of missing out. So when we engage with our audience, sometimes if it's done, and if we go back to the previous slide, if we're doing it midway or near the end of our presentation, you see this lull or this dip at that 30 to 40 minute mark. Because if we're just talking at our audience the entire time, they're probably a little tuned out. I mean, I think about back to math lab science or something like that, where I was just kind of staring at the whiteboard the whole time. And you're thinking I'm thinking about something else. I'm tuning out. But when you catch these people early on, you kind of say hey, I have this expectation to engage with you. Tell me what you think. It shows that I not only care about what you have to say, but again, going back and showing this poll response rate by poll numbers, is that when we poll more and more, people start to get more involved. And so they're like, oh, this is interesting. I'm finding out what my, the other attendees are here. I'm not just on this floating island attending this webinar alone. I'm part of a group, even though I can't see them. I'm part of this community right now. And so poll responses tend to actually increase as the number of polls increase. Obviously, I'm sure that there's, a point.
There's probably a max. There's a limit.
Polls, but we see 3 to 4 polls in a presentation to work very effectively.
You know what? I think this is also the similar parallel to this is email. I think people are worried about bothering people, and you see the poll as this intrusion, and you think, oh, we shouldn't do it too many times. I mean, I'm actually even in the course of this conversation, I'm rethinking even how I approach it. I've always limited myself to 3, and I tried to distribute them, but I'm actually thinking now I'm going to come out faster with these, because I realized I did a talk yesterday here at the B2B Marketing Exchange conference, and in the middle of it, I realized my natural speaking style, I poll early to make sure that I'm talking about stuff that is relevant, and I change my content on the fly based on the level that the people tell me they're at. And so you've got me rethinking actually how I'm gonna be a little more aggressive in my polls.
As I think you should. I mean, knowing that you are connecting with folks early on is just going to always have a better effect. People know that they're a little bit on their toes now. They're a little bit more engaged.
Something might happen,
now that you know their opinions. So it's good stuff.
And I think I was going to say the parallel to me a little bit is email, because I think oftentimes we think I don't want to email too much, and most marketers fail to email enough.
Oh yeah.
Going back into that promotion bit, like I think people think I sent one email to promote my webinar, and it's like, yeah, but what about the other three? Like, it's like it actually takes a lot of touches. And when you send people email more frequently, people get used to getting your emails. And I think, and they actually are more likely to engage in them. So I think I'm seeing a little bit of a parallel here of being willing to put it in and like the audience coming back. And there will be people that don't like it, but guess what? They weren't your people. If they don't want to answer polls about those questions, they don't need to be in this webinar. Like they probably aren't that interested. So what does the data say about webinars? I mean, I think that is kind of what we were chatting about here a little bit. Like you've got this great benchmark report. I know you put it in the handout so everybody can read it, but is there a best, because people ask me this, is there a best day of the week? Is there a best time? We already talked about triggering polls, but tell me day of the week and the host, because I have a guess about what I think it is, but you have real data.
I do have real data, and I'm going to say that I think your guess is probably right. When we pulled the data, and just so you guys know, when we pulled this data, we took it from 1.6 million webinars hosted on BigMarker in the past year. So this is our 2023 report. And, essentially what we did is we took that, we pared it down to the very best data, which is like, a sample size of about the top 10%, I think it was. Mary Ellen, I'm curious to know your guess, because I have a feeling it's right. So tell me what you think the best
My best day of the week, I say either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, really. Never on Mondays, because people are way too slammed and just trying to figure out what's going on. Never on Fridays, because people are like, hell no. Like, just don't do it, because they're trying to just get through their list. So it's midweek. And then for time of the day, for me, it's a balance of like, I have to know when my audience is, and I aim for midday when the majority of my audience is going to be available. And since most of my folks are US, but there's some European, I lean toward like an 11 Central, which gives me good break time for most of my US, it gives me decent US coverage. I'm not asking my Pacific Coast people to wake up super early, and it's also possible for my Europeans to join.
Right.
Now I'm screwing over India, but and China, but like they'll have to catch it on demand. So I aim for 11 o'clock on Tuesday is my perfect webinar time. What does the data say?
Okay, so the data says, and I'm looking at the chat, making sure that I'm accounting for everyone. So everyone agrees it's midweek, right? You said midweek, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Paul says Tuesday. Amasede says Wednesday or Thursday midday. So everyone is, like throw away the report because everyone's right. So the data says that Wednesdays are the optimal time to host, and these are B2B marketing webinars. So obviously if you are hosting a lifestyle webinar or something that's, not serving, something that you do for work, maybe weekends and Fridays and things like that are better, or evenings. But for B2B marketing webinars, we see webinars at 1 p.m. in your local time are the optimal kind of time to host and, also have attendees join your webinars. And what you said, I think, is really interesting, Mary Ellen. And this is something that, as we all expand globally, we want to, fit within a global time zone or, within our audience's schedules. And so what we also saw is we saw very early morning and mid-morning, times as being close second and third. And the reason being, what we kind of can, attribute this to is having that global audience. So again, you all know your attendees and your audiences better than, me. But what I can say is that those are typically the best times to host. Robin says Friday at 5 p.m. Maybe for your audience, but I don't know about ours.
No, Robin's being silly. Yeah. Like she would never. She is definitely at the bar by then. Yeah. No, let's see. All right. Let's talk about repackaging our content. This is something that we do a lot. And I know BigMarker also has an approach to this. Why don't you talk first, Hannah? What do you do what are some of the things that you see people do with their content? So you do a webinar, then what?
So one webinar does not equal one piece of content. And I want to say it again, because this is so, so important for so many things, right? Your ROI, the reason that we're putting all this effort into this piece of content. One piece of content is not the same as one webinar, because your webinar can be turned into multiple pieces of content. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have this live piece of content that happens within, your live audience. And then as you mentioned earlier, Mary Ellen, you can publish that piece of content as an on-demand asset. So, having people being able to watch it on their own time is great. We can even add in engagement pieces back into the on-demand, which actually optimizes it. So not only are we capturing potentially a larger audience to not only view, but also register for that on-demand, but we can also, put a window in for Q&A, or we can ask the same poll questions. We can parse out a little bit more data from, that audience or that subset of that audience, who didn't attend or who might have wanted to just register for the recording. But what else can we do with it? So you had made mention a little bit earlier about not being super fond of the concept of like automated, or kind of simu-live webinars. But I actually do want to make a case for it, because I think that in a lot of cases, if we're doing things like, like you mentioned with demos, or with content that we want to kind of have more longevity, we want to make it evergreen. You can repurpose your live webinar as an automated resource or asset to continue to allow people to register for it and attend it as if it was in real time. Now, there are ways to do this well, and then there's ways to do it not well. Obviously, the way to not do it well is to throw it up there and then just have it basically the same experience as if they were to click play on a YouTube video. That's not engaging anyone, right? So how do we actually optimize that webinar? So the first thing, at least in BigMarker speak, is that when you host a simulated live webinar, we call it automated or evergreen, depending on how you schedule it, is that you can open up the audience engagement features exactly the same as if you are hosting it live. So that means you can have the chat open. You can have a Q&A where you can even go live in the Q&A. It's still hosted in a live environment. So even if you wanted to jump on at the end and, reserve time for a 10, 15, 20-minute Q&A at the end, you can still do that. You can trigger polls, you can share offers and handouts and all of the kind of engaging pieces, even, the audience reactions as we see on screen today. You can do all of that. And so you can actually kind of repurpose or reutilize this one piece of content. And yes, it may not be the exact same magic as the live session, but at least you have that so that, it can kind of generate more leads and be, that engine, from that one piece of content where you don't really have to do anything for it. You could even set up, notifications so that if and when somebody does, ask a question, you can jump in so you don't even have to hang out the whole time. So that's, number 3 on the list. The fourth and final thing, and then I want to pass it to you to see if you have any other ideas, is breaking up your video, your recording into snackable pieces of content. So what do I mean by that? So maybe a main point, maybe 1-minute blurb that you're kind of slicing out of that video, that recording, and then you're doing something with it. You're putting it online, you're putting it on LinkedIn, on social, wherever you're putting it. And then what you can do is you can have people drawn in, and then you can have them register for the real thing. So they get a little bit of, a little piece of it. They can, it entices them to want to learn more, and then they can register for it. So those are my recommendations. Mary Ellen, what are yours?
Yeah, Amanda has raised her hand twice. If you want to type your question in the chat, we will definitely jump in and answer it. So please just go ahead and drop that question in. I want to actually, so these are all things that we do with it as well. And I want to talk a little bit about even like how we do that. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat for y'all to a platform called Lately. And you can actually get a little discount on it if you go through this link. Lately is an AI-powered tool that will take that recording of that full webinar and you can feed it in and it will come back with your cuts, suggested cuts for social of the link that they're supposed to be. Now, can you just take that and publish that? No, you need to go through and double check that that actually was a good start, where the idea started and where it finished. But it can take a process that could otherwise take you hours and it can turn it into more like 30 minutes. It's a pretty powerful tool. The founder actually used to work in social at Walmart, and it definitely knows how to do social at scale. And then she built this beautiful, beautiful tool. And it's a built for purpose AI tool. So if you're figuring out how to make sense of like, all the chat GPT, and all the different writing tools, I call this one, this is the baby steps. You can take your webinar and feed it in there and see what happens. It's a very, very cool tool. But we use it. The other thing I will do is writing a sort of pillar pages. If a topic, because I'm building a campaign, the thing to think about this is a cornerstone asset. And I think for a lot of us, especially if we're working in services. Our consultants are very good at doing webinars. Like webinars are their strength. Let them do that. And then you don't have to bug them for a call, that subject matter expert. They just did it one time. And now you have it. It's blog posts, it's pillar pages, it's cutting up that content. It's putting it in the emails. I mean, you can make ads out of it for your campaigns. The list is endless. So the real challenge here is just sit down and map out your campaign and everywhere on your buyer journey, basically, that you think you need content. And I promise, if you have a webinar in there, that webinar is going to be like a top to mid funnel activity, but you can cut it up and turn it into tofu. If you put it up as like an SEO post, you can turn it into Bofu if it's something that's like you're sending it out to people like that you're about to sign. I mean, there's just like so much you could do here. There's so much.
I've even seen people turn it into a podcast, rip the audio, the MP3 file of it and throw it on their site. I mean, people get really creative with the content.
They do. There's a lot that you can do here, but like, I'd say the way to make it not overwhelming is literally just sit down with that campaign, sit down and look at that buyer journey, and then think about where your webinar fits in, and then brainstorm all the things you can break off. Because we'll pull a transcript, like you mentioned with the whys and the guides in the white paper, we'll pull a transcript, and that's the first draft. That's the first draft of the guide. And then it's a logical thing to send somebody. I mean, we're sending these nurture emails. Like, well, what are you nurturing exactly? Like, and what are you going to send there? But if I send you a guide based on the topic of the webinar, that is a logical thing to send me based on my indicated interest. That is progressive engagement. That is not spam. Like, that is something relevant and interesting.
Right.
All right. Yes. Amanda, play with the features by all means. Like, she's like, I'm just playing with this. Like, keep going. See, Hannah likes that. Hannah wants you to like try out all the features. This is another one that comes up. We talk about virtual events versus a webinar. I think sometimes it's the word webinar. It's like, we don't do webinars. We do virtual events. And virtual events sounds like way cooler, right? I have a distinction that I draw between the two. And I'm curious, so Hannah, how do you define a virtual event versus a webinar?
Well, I'm going to ask you first, because I think my answer is going to be longer.
Oh, yeah, it probably is, because you literally spend your entire life thinking about this. To me, a webinar it's a web seminar. It's basically literally, to go back to like how we coined this term, and it is one-off, and it is discrete. It's usually not more than an hour, and it covers like a specific topic, and it's an isolated thing. A virtual event, for me, by definition, has to be more complex than that. It is often like a half day or a full day, or sometimes, I don't recommend this, multiple days of content that are all around a theme, and that they're often of higher importance strategically. We have higher expectations for how they're going to perform and like the role that they play. So I might, in the context of Managing Editor, for example, our brand magazine, we do 2 Managing Editor live events per year. They are half-day summits, we call them. They have a theme. There's like a series of things that are all around the company. There's also more experiences like kind of wrapped up into it. We put a lot into that. And I also have significantly, our registration for that, it's 1,000 people is what I want to see for that. My webinars are monthly. They're about one little topic. They're just me hanging out with somebody cool like Hannah, and I only need a few hundred people to make that successful. And they're very tactical and very specific. That's my distinction.
So, I mean, perfect distinction all the way through. I think, you hit the nail on the head. What I would do to expand. So I agree. A webinar is a piece of content, a singular piece of content. So again, we might be promoting it. We might, be hoping for, a certain reg number, but when we think about virtual events, they are typically more robust, right? So the cool thing about working at BigMarker is I know all of the features, functionality, and use cases that go into virtual events. And obviously each one is a snowflake, each one is very different. But what I can tell the audience today about virtual events is that, again, it is typically going to be more of a summit or series or day or multi-day or half day, whatever it is, this kind of elongated event that, again, as you mentioned, revolves around a single topic or pillar of content, whatever it might be. And what we saw a lot of in the pandemic, in fact, was folks who were bringing their in-person events, conferences, whatever they were, and bringing them into the virtual realm. And a lot of cool things happened, in that process, because it kind of brought those events into the 21st century, if you will. It gave access to a lot of features and functionality that didn't exist before, but it also taught us a lot about what attendees expect, what they want, what they like, what they don't like, and how we can kind of recreate the magic of in-person events into the online space. And so what does that mean? Well, you're never going to recreate it 100%. I mean, meeting somebody face to face, by nature as human beings, it's just, it's always going to be, preferable when we're networking or things like that. But the outcome of virtual events is that we have built out features that really tailor fit to the experiences and how they best work in the virtual realm. And so obviously looking through the lens of what BigMarker offers when we talk about virtual events is things like, optimizing networking experiences for virtual attendees, meaning like AI-based, one-to-one speed networking, having almost like a business Tinder, recreating business.
That's a horrible idea. I'm not meeting you. Swipe left. Yes. No. Right.
But people love it, and they get to face-to-face interact. And they also utilize things like virtual business cards so that they can exchange them. Because if you remember back to events, and Mary Ellen, you're at one right now, and you get a handful of business cards and you're thinking, God, I had all of these meaningful connections, but I can't remember who is who or what was what. Having them all in a virtual realm is great. So networking is kind of one of those optimized experiences. Also, you have things like being able to build and manage your own agenda. What sessions do I want to attend? And, how do I want to attend them? Do I want to attend 20 minutes of this session and jump to 20 minutes of the other one? Do I want to watch the recording of this one? What's meaningful to me? How can I manage my calendar and my time a little bit better? Those are all going to be those factors, those optimization pieces from the attendees' perspective. Also, you have on the host perspective, what is going to be more beneficial to me? Obviously, it's data capture. It's making sure that the audience is having a good time. It's making sure that they're able to self-navigate and, experience your event the way that you'd want them to. And so with each piece of the pie or the puzzle, if you will, you're getting data points. You're seeing how many attendees joined each session. You're seeing for how long they stayed. You're seeing, okay, Jane Doe, she did go to 20 minutes of that session and then 20 minutes of that, and then she went to network. All of those things, now we get to see with virtual events. But, it's just kind of this bigger, more robust experience that is essentially what I would boil it down to is a compilation of webinars, if you will. But, there's certain engagement practices that we do a little bit differently on the virtual event side of things.
I want to talk about hybrid a little bit, because you mentioned the in-person and the back and forth. That is one of the things that right now is everybody's trying to figure out how to do this. And in my mind, easy, like I'd say a virtual event is relatively easy in terms of complexity. An in-person event is more complex. A hybrid event is like orders of magnitude more complex than either. And to do well, I feel like the things that you do to make for a good experience virtually are often inherently in conflict with the things you would do to make for a good experience in person, and vice versa. And I'm curious, because I know that you've built out the capabilities at BigMarker to be able to handle these hybrid events. Like, what are some of the things that people are doing really well?
And you've hit the nail on the head of every single pain point that we're doing to kind of navigate towards a better experience for hybrid, because you kind of alluded to this, but I'm going to say it outright. When people, went virtual because they had to, they wanted to go back to in-person immediately. And some of the things that folks saw right away is, we're not getting the same audience size. We're not getting the 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 50,000 attendees that we did virtually as we, are with in-person, just because of, scheduling constraints or, whatever, accessibility kind of hindrance that you would have with in-person. So you have that. And then you also have, the data set that's lost. We don't get to see what they're doing anymore. And so to solve those kind of two pieces or those two gaps, and then we'll get into optimization in just a moment, a lot of folks went for let's do hybrid. So hybrid, for those of you who are kind of unfamiliar with the term, is just the concept of offering experiences for both virtual and in-person attendees for the same event. And so it could be as small as a single webinar where you have on-site attendees and virtual attendees, or it could be as big as a 3-day conference where you have a full-blown event happening in a, in a giant, auditorium or hotel or, wherever you are. And then you have a virtual audience as well. So again, each event is different. Maybe you just have a live stream pushing up to a virtual audience, or maybe you have two, kind of concurrently happening events. But to go back to what you said, Mary Ellen, this sounds very complicated and it sounds like a lot of work. So how do we solve for that? Well, the first answer is that it is a lot of work, but we don't expect you to do it alone. So at least, with BigMarker and how we operate, we really look at it as a partnership. So we are the tech partner to help you achieve your event. And we certainly don't expect you as the event producer to know how to produce a full-blown virtual event that, kind of nicely, jives with the in-person event. And so how do we do this? Well, the first thing is, we have to decide, what elements are going to be virtual and what elements are going to be in person. And then we also have to make sure that we are optimizing for both. So the big thing is to not do, which, we are tempted to do, is offer the exact same experiences in both experience. And the reason why that doesn't work is that, again, when you have this kind of networking magic that happens in person, we can't really recreate that the same exact way virtually. So we have to think about it differently. And so again, our team, when you come on to BigMarker or wherever you're working, for your hybrid event, is we work with you to decipher what your goals are, what you need, what you want. And then, we make the recommendations of what we've not only seen done really well, but what tech we have and what features we think would work best for your specific event. So that's kind of the short answer. The long answer is, how do we connect these two audiences? Or I guess the other side of the coin is how do we connect these two audiences? So we do it in a couple of ways. The first thing is that the virtual attendees often get kind of left out of the conversation when we're doing a live Q&A, for example, an on-site, attendee Q&A, for example. And so what we do typically is we unify this experience using the same technology that you guys are all using today to chat or Q&A or utilize features like polling and so on for the virtual audience, but we also put it in the hands of in-person attendees. And so what you guys may have experienced yourselves or seen out there is the concept of a mobile companion app, or a mobile app that is essentially kind of an enhancement or a companion to the in-person experience when you're attending an in-person event. And so what we can do is not only unify those experiences for both virtual and in-person attendees, but it also brings back the data points. So you have, all of the scans, for example, when you're checking in, when you're scanning into a session, when you're visiting an expo booth, scanning those data points now come back into the mix. You as an event host are obviously very excited to receive those data points, but it also allows you to optimize your experiences. So again, that agenda scheduler that I was talking about, being able to favorite and add to calendar and get notifications and all of the things that you kind of miss when you're attending in person, now that tech is brought back into the mix. So probably a longer answer than you're expecting, but there's a lot of elements, a lot of parts or pieces that go into hybrid. It's definitely a conversation, but when we look at the ROI, it's massively beneficial. And again, it definitely makes sense in the long run.
One thing, we have 7 minutes to answer some questions, and we have some good ones here. Robin asked, 30-minute webinar versus 60-minute. Does one perform better or significantly worse than the other? And I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm actually a fan of the 60-minute webinar. We've done 31-minute ones in the past, and they just felt pretty rushed. Think about this particular presentation. This was an hour. And I think in a 30-minute webinar, you have like a couple of minutes of coming on and getting settled. And then you might have like 20, 25 minutes to talk. And then you're out in like 5 minutes or questions, and then you're done. So if a topic is small enough to be addressed in 30 minutes that way, I think your product webinars might need to be like that. It's like it's about how engaging it is. Frankly, if you do things like, I'm noticing that most people stayed for this entire webinar. If I were doing webinars and I saw that most people were leaving, I would say, I either need to rethink my content or I need to shrink this in and make this shorter, that this isn't going to work for people. So I think that's going to be very audience specific, and I think it's going to be very topic specific. But there's nothing inherently wrong with a 1-hour webinar if it's interesting. Just like people will also read long form content. They will read long reports. They will read like, so you want to have different versions of things. People they know they can come in and leave. They don't like it, right? They can always step out. I've actually never had somebody tell me that a webinar was too long. Like that's never been a thing that came up in any feedback of anyone I've done. And I've done some 90-minute sessions that were like workshops. I have had people say, oh, I wish that had been longer. I could have kept talking about that for a while. Or I'll have sometimes people say, oh, I have to go. I have to run another meeting. This was so good. I hate leaving it. Like you don't want to bore people, but if you're boring people, the length is probably not the problem. Mm-hmm. It's probably the type of content. It's probably things like what Hannah was describing, like come out and make it engaging from the start. People will leave a 15-minute webinar if it's just you drone into a PowerPoint. So make it interesting. The other thing I will say on that, if you do your webinars and you're in an industry that has a certification body and you want people to be able to take your educational webinars and get certified for them, they almost always specify some sort of minimum length. And 30 minutes will rarely do it. So they typically need to be. Sometimes you see that hour, Robin. I think in our industry, if this is Robin Schooling, and I believe it is in HR and HR tech, it's because all of our certifying bodies all require a minimum of an hour. That's why all of our vendors do 1-hour webinars. So Hannah, what about you? What do you think is there a better length based on the data that you've seen?
So the data says that, shorter is going to be more attention grabbing from, an audience engagement perspective, just outright. However, I agree with you in the sense that if you have, let's say, multiple talking heads like we have today, we have multiple engagement points, your content, as long as you have something to say for that duration, can be, as long as you need it to be. Where I don't recommend, kind of thinking about or formulating your content is based on just the timestamp. If we're thinking about we need to fill a 60-minute time slot, but we only have 20 minutes of stuff to say, I wouldn't do it that way. So again, it depends on how you're creating your webinars, the content that you're producing, and how you're engaging with your audience. But as long as you have something to say, and as long as you are keeping it engaging, it's not really the time that matters. It's, how you're producing your content. So I agree with you, Mary Ellen. But we do see trends towards shorter webinars nowadays. But again, it's, it's a lot of it is in response to Zoom fatigue and things like that. That was really experienced at the height of the pandemic.
Also, Zoom is not a webinar platform. I just want to go ahead and tell everybody that. Hannah, you can't say it, so I'll say it for you. I mean, you could, but it would sound funny. I can tell you, like, a lot of times people will do their webinars and it's just frankly it's not dynamic enough and it doesn't capture all the information that you need as a marketer. I think it's easy. And if your choices are no webinar versus doing my webinar in Zoom, do it in Zoom. But just know that as you get more mature in how you approach it, you're going to want to look at some different tools. Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to say, somebody said, I'm in cybersecurity doing channel marketing, and I'd love to learn how to keep my webinars interesting. Mm-hmm. The answer to that is actually to think, so I love channel marketing. Channel marketing is actually it's like a special kind of B2B place in my heart, because like you have a different buyer and you have to develop a whole different value prop. It's actually not the same as your end user. And so I think if you want to make that interesting, you have to ask yourself and ask your partners, what information do you need from me? And I think you might be surprised at how simple and basic it often is. Because they want to know, here's what we've got updated. This is where you probably can get away with some product stuff, because they want to know what you're selling now. Okay, what is the latest? Like, what do we have to do? Those can be good 30 minutes. Every 30 minutes, you could absolutely do a weekly webinar and you say, here's what's new. Here's what's in the market. Beyond that, I also do a lot of, I use SEO, like research, to generate topics, because again, I make campaigns. So I go look and see what people are searching for. What is my buyer looking for? And I make a webinar about that. So the secret is actually in the specificity. Mm-hmm. Don't make general things. Make specific things that answer the questions that your target audience wants information on. Mm-hmm. So what would you add to that? I was going to
say, we always say, by the laws of marketing, if you try to appeal to everyone, you won't appeal to anyone, or really appeal to anyone. And the exactly what you said, Mary Ellen, where it's just like, we have to know what our personas, what our desired attendees are going to want to know about. And if we don't know who our personas or our ICP or who will be attending our webinars, we should probably figure that out first. But we should really kind of hone in on what's interesting to them. Why should they care? Why am I an expert in this field? If I'm not, am I pulling somebody else in who is? And how can we start thinking about or framing our content around what will specifically serve that ICP ICP or those ICPs that we've established.
Mm-hmm.
ICP, for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym, is Ideal Customer Profile.
Yeah, it's like we keep making up it's the new buyer persona. You can't, when that's too many words for you, like that's too many letters for you to say out loud. Now it's just ICP. It's just the person. Just think of that human being that you want to register. What are they going to care about? What are they going to be interested in? And get specific. Don't be afraid to get really specific. I mean, one of my most successful webinars so far in the last 6 months was content marketing for insurance. And it's like, it's very clear who that's for, right? There's only one type of person that's coming to that. And that is a person who does marketing at an insurance company, which happens to be my buyer. Mm-hmm. So it's okay to be that specific and ask the buyers what they want. We also ask people, what would you like us to do a thing on? That's actually how this webinar one came about. They're like, your webinars are good. Can you tell us how to do webinars? I'm like, that's meta. Let me see what Hannah's doing. So, all right. Well, I think that brings us to time. For those of you, if you want to stay in touch, our LinkedIn profiles are over here in the channel. Feel free to reach out. You can also hit us up if you want to know more about BigMarker. I can talk about it from a customer standpoint. Obviously, Hannah can put you in touch with someone. If you want to just move right past me and go straight to them, that's also fine with me. I won't be hurt. But yeah, no, I think thanks for everybody for spending the time with us. Hannah, thank you for joining us. I love that you put the report in there. Y'all go check out that report. I think that can give you some good ammo when you're talking. One of the questions earlier was like, I start my stuff, but then leadership bogs me down and I can't get it done. It's like, there's some good ammo in that report that can help show like why they need to get out of your way and let you do the work. So borrow that liberally.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. And thank you all for joining today. It was such a pleasure to be on. I hope you learned something new and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, cool. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Bye.